Nathaniel Turner was born in Virginia on the plantation of Samuel Turner in 1800. He was an intelligent Baptist preacher that let Christianity guide him on his journey as an abolitionist leader on his plantation. Turner was heavily spiritual and was influenced by the Bible when planning his violent revolt against many of the white slaveholders in his area. I chose to research Nat Turner because I learned about his contribution to the African American community a while ago, but I did not have knowledge of his reasoning or spiritual influence for planning such a huge massacre. I also watched the movie Birth of a Nation and got to really imagine what his life was like growing up as a preacher on a plantation and seeing all his friends and family be treated horribly by slaveholders. After watching the movie, which was extremely harsh, it made me understand what led Nat and his people to murder. His story interests me because although he is an impactful leader in history, his ways of fighting the cause could raise certain ethical questions. The first thing I learned was about Nat Turner's life. Growing up, Turner was very smart and everyone around, whites and blacks, took notice. Many blacks said if they had his intelligence, they would never serve a man. Nat ended up memorizing the Bible and he loved to read anything he could get his hands on. His master also took notice and had him preach and give prayers wherever they went. Nat Turner was privileged because his master saw his potential and allowed him to learn those raw skills. Despite this, many white slave owners did not want blacks to become of equal intelligence because they did not see them as equal beings. They deprived blacks of basic needs to keep them unintelligent and easy to control. Although Nat was not in the fields picking cotton, he still was bound and treated badly by whites. He also had to sit back on multiple occasions and watch as his people were beaten to death. Nat Turner's intelligence allowed him to be on the white people's intellectual level and feel like he could stand against them when the time came. The second thing I learned was the ways God influenced his path to change. He began having visions that showed brawls between the whites and blacks. He knew this was how he and his people would gain their freedom. The third thing was Gabriel Prosser and how his conspiracy of 1800 put a lot of fear in white Virginians and made it even harder for slaves to revolt at that time. It was planned on a Saturday night and consisted of hundreds of slaves gathering and marching in Richmond into the Capitol Square to obtain weapons. After, they would set fire as a diversion and kill whites in the process. His ultimate plan was to take the governor hostage and negotiate an end to slavery. Although his plan failed, it did cause whites to fear their safety. In response, the colonial government decided to ban all kinds of meetings and groups held by slaves at night. This made associations and secret meetings illegal and prevented many conspiracies for revolts to take place. During the trial, over 26 blacks were executed due to this conspiracy. The fourth thing I learned about was the details of Nat Turner's revolt. The night of the 1831 revolt, Nat gathered a few of his close friends, Hark, Nelson, Henry, and Sam, and he shared with them his plans to slaughter the serpents with their own weapons. So they snuck into his master's house, Joseph Travis, and slaughtered the whole family. They didn't spare anyone, not even children. Then he assembled a group of soldiers, around 50 or 60 slaves, and they began looting houses and murdering all the slaveholders in the area. They traveled and led a huge massacre. It lasted till the next morning, which turned into a huge fight between the whites and blacks. Nat ended up going into hiding after this night for around 6 weeks. The last thing I learned during my research was during these weeks after the revolt, whites and blacks feared their lives. Blacks were being killed for any suspicion of involvement in the massacre, and whites feared their slaves would turn on them. To prevent this and the fear of ending slavery, whites began making their slaves appear happy and taken care of. They also explained that slavery benefited everyone. Along with this, scientists stated that black people were built for human labor based on their body stature. During this time, around 200 slaves and 60 whites were slaughtered. After Nat ended up being found and captured, he confessed to the murders and shared his reasons before his execution. Nat Turner's approach to standing against slavery is considered radical compared to the protests we see today. In this generation, people incite violence through words rather than physical bloody massacres. Despite his violence, Nat Turner's revolt inspired many slaves to be courageous and showed them that together they had the power to fight for their freedom. I chose to write about Nat Turner because he left a huge impact on African American history. His revolt showed that blacks were no longer looked at as powerless, but instead they had fight in them. It invoked fear in many whites because they started to realize that slaves had the courage to fight for their freedom. Learning about this topic and reading about the killings was kind of hard because it made me understand the pain and fear everyone experienced during this time. I definitely sympathize with Nat and other slaves, even though they used violent means, because they felt as if this was the only way to get people listening.